It can sure be difficult to determine truth from fiction in the age of social media, what with AI pictures and entire stories just made up just to bait you, maybe written off as satire just to get clicks. But that's hardly a new thing. Among the many discoveries of archaeology and anthropology and paleontology in the American West in the 19th century, there were a few that turned out to be, well, mistaken stories or maybe even outright fabrications. And people in the East were so used to amazing discoveries, you could see how they might believe something like that the American West was once inhabited by a race of giants, or that there were the remains of a fantastic ancient civilization undiscovered in a land where so much was undiscovered. And heck, some newspapermen were even perfectly willing to make that sort of thing up, and the readers just as willing to believe it.
Possibly the most famous archaeological hoax in American history is the Cardiff Giant, which all began because a man named George Hull lost an argument about evolution with a reverend at a Methodist revival meeting. Determined to show how easy it would be to fool people, he had a fake petrified giant made. Petrification was a popular topic of the day, and numerous newspapers had published stories about supposed petrified people. Mark Twain wrote a famous false article about a fake petrified man found in Nevada. The 10-foot tall, 3,000-pound gypsum giant created a sensation until Hull revealed it was a hoax. Several other similar hoaxes were perpetrated across the country. It wasn't just fake petrified men that claimed to be evidence of an ancient society of giants. On April 8, 1885, the New York Times reported a truly incredible story under the title Missouri's Buried City. The Times described a city found at the bottom of a coal shaft, 360 feet deep. A hard and thick stratum of lava arches in the buried city, the streets of which are regularly laid out. Explorers found a hall 30 feet by 100 feet with stone benches and tools of all description. They even found a fountain with perfectly pure water. Perhaps most stunning was the discovery of a giant human skeleton. According to the Times, the city recorder of Moberly and city marshal vouched for the story and had been part of the exploration. The St. Louis Evening Chronicle reported the same, a wonderful subterranean city. The Chronicle went into even greater detail, describing the entire party, including supposedly the correspondent himself, probably J.W. Estes of the Moberly Monitor. The correspondent described walls that had evidently been constructed by the labor of human hands, and things absolutely beyond his belief had he not witnessed them with his own eyes. They found dressed limestone masonry, workbenches covered with rotting wood that crumbled at a touch. One of the men was nearly killed when a statue almost fell on him. The statues were made of a species of bronze, unlike bronze used in the modern day. They then discovered the fountain and skeleton, which they left where it lay, though they took tools, chunks of stone, and more before going to the surface when their lamps ran low on oil. The following day, a second article appeared in the Evening Chronicle, claiming the story was not half told. The article promised that geologists were on the way to enlighten the minds of the doubting and unbelieving, and described a second expedition. This second expedition included another list of names who found a life-size petrification of pure stone, consisting of a mother mounted upon a rudely constructed chair, nursing an infant at her breast. There was also a man kneeling in prayer, worshipping a three-headed idol that looked like the ancient god Isis. The article ended with the apparently tongue-in-cheek, "Of course it all reads and sounds like a story pertaining to mythology, but truth is might and will prevail." If that story sounds too good to be true, it certainly was. Though it was widely reported as factual, only 2 days later, the Logansport Daily Pharos reported that the Moberly Monitor editor-in-chief admitted that the story was an April hoax, with not a word of truth in it. On April 13th, Tim Collins, who owned the mine the explorers supposedly entered, said the story was a sheer fabrication designed to do great injury, and that the names of the parties as given are fictitious. The Charlton Courier reported that the Evening Chronicle was the victim of misplaced confidence in one J.W. Estes. Another paper called it a miserable fabrication, and calling it interesting reading if for no other reason than to show how thoroughly the art of lying has been mastered in these latter times. In 1905, after the death of Colonel John Provians, editor of the Moberly Monitor, the paper printed the real story. John Estes, 22 at the time, was city editor for the Monitor, in addition to being correspondent for the Evening Chronicle. According to the article, Estes brought the story to Provines, claiming that they'd been blasting in the South Entry in Tim Collins' coal mine and run into a buried city. As news of the story spread, the tale quickly disintegrated under scrutiny. But despite that, it brought considerable attention and tourism to the town. Collins, however, was not amused. He put a sign outside the mine that said, "No buried city lunatics allowed on these premises." The mine itself collapsed in 1899, and despite the perpetrator admitting that he made the story up, the story has continued to have a life of its own into the modern era. Some still claim that this underground city of giants exists, waiting to be rediscovered. Stories of ancient cities were not uncommon in the era. In 1892, the Spokane Review reported that William Hanley of Ashland had discovered an ancient city in eastern Oregon near Silver Lake. One side of the square has been traced to 400 or 500 yards, the article claimed. The top of a pyramid stuck just above the surface and resembled the pyramids of Arizona and Mexico. The city evidently antedates the Aztecs and Toltecs, the paper read, without a shred of evidence, admitting that no geologist had yet visited the ruins. No such site actually exists. In 1877, the Chicago Times published a report coming from Lake City, Colorado, a small town in the San Juan Mountains. Rumors had persisted that the rugged land beyond the mountains and along the valleys there abounded with gold, and finally a prospector named W. W. Remini decided to discover the truth in June of 1876. He discovered an Eden in a valley near the confluence of the San Miguel and Dolores River, where the animals had never been hunted, and allowed him to get within a few yards. Nearby, on a level plateau on the west bank of the Dolores River, he discovered an ancient city. While there are ruins in the region, the ruins he described were fantastic indeed. Ruins and fragments of pottery were spread over acres, and a temple evidently devoted to worship of the sun looked nearly pristine, 120 feet wide and 300 feet long, with plaster that still held paint. Most amazingly, the city was ringed for miles around by a 50-foot thick wall. Remini even claimed to have entered one of the buildings and rappelled into the buried portion, finding a building with a dozen different apartments with floors of solid cedar logs. It also mentions that he found a rude figure of a dove bearing a twig or branch of some kind and flying towards a mountain in the distance, a possible reference to the story of Noah's Ark. He returned to Silverton, Colorado in August of 1876, and the article went on to claim that Remini proved the San Miguel as one of the most wonderful mining districts in the United States. The river, one vast placer. Of course, these ruins, as fantastic as they sound, have not been found, and by his description likely would have been if they were real. The article reads more as an invitation to explore the western slope of Colorado, where untold wonders and, more importantly, gold could be found in abundance. And while gold has been found in the area, it certainly never lived up to the article's promise. In October of 1896, the St. Louis Globe-Democrat published a long article chronicling the supposed journey of Professor Alfred Eldridge. Eldridge was a professor from Montreal who had, in 1892, set off on a mission of discovery to Alaska. Been without contact for most of those 4 years before miraculously reappearing in 1896, when reporter James S. Hammond was able to meet him in New York City and relate an incredible tale. According to Eldridge, after a long journey, he arrived at the northern coast of the Seward Peninsula of Alaska, where he reached the mouth of the Kewalik River. There, the local Native Americans attempted to dissuade him from traveling further, explaining unbearable perils galore which I would be certain to encounter. Finally, the chief admitted that many people had already gone missing attempting to follow the river inland. Eldridge continued anyway, following the river about 400 miles up the stream until he reached a small lake. There he noticed a recent landslide. My attention was drawn to a spot halfway up a steep peak, which had evidently suffered some recent disturbance. The first thing to attract me was the discovery of a small piece of broken earthenware with an artistically worked trimming of Greek design, the same he claimed as pieces he had found in New Mexico years earlier. Curiosity piqued, he looked around more closely and soon saw the protrusion of a wall of dull gray masonry about 300 yards away. Began walking around the area, finding more walls. Soon became evident to me that I had discovered an American Pompeii, he told Hammond. The first wall was, according to his description, 3 feet thick, while others were as thick as 5 feet, and each made of hewn sandstone blocks of approximately even size. He found much more, including a copper spade to which he strapped a makeshift handle and began digging. Every shovelful contained artifacts, including pots, vases, cups, plates, jugs, popes, and numerous articles of doubtful use and too heavy to bring away with me. He judged he had dug into someone's china closet, likely a warrior who kept his implements of battle upon the bottom shelf, as there he found arrows, spears of odd design, scrapers, hatchets, and drills. He described some of the pottery as the finest he had ever seen, finished in a way that is a lost art to modern potters. He found 8-foot-tall jars, perfectly preserved as the china just delivered from the hands of our 19th century potters. But that was all the archaeologist would say just then, claiming that he was not prepared to make any further comments, but that his discovery opens an entirely new and extensive field for archaeological study. The article was reprinted in newspapers all over the country, largely without comment, filling pages from Anaconda, Montana to Piqua, Ohio. Despite all of that attention, there was no follow up. Eldridge simply disappears, and no other report of this American Pompeii seems to appear in any paper again. No archaeological site matching this description exists in the Seward Peninsula. Almost as little can be found about the correspondent, James Hammond. The best conclusion is that the whole story was simply a newspaper hoax. On March 12, 1909, an innocuous article in the Arizona Gazette mentioning that G.E. Kincaid had arrived in Yuma after a journey down the Colorado River from Green River, Wyoming, and that he had captured 700 images of the canyons using a fine camera. It's not clear if the newspaper planted the article with a later article in mind, but it mentioned that some interesting archaeological discoveries were unearthed. The following month, a much more remarkable article appeared, titled Explorations in Grand Canyon, claiming that remarkable finds indicate ancient people migrated from Orient. The discovery the paper lauded is now regarded by scientists as not only the oldest archaeological discovery in the United States, but one of the most valuable in the world. Kincaid was the primary source for the story, and he related that archaeologists of the Smithsonian Institute have made discoveries which almost conclusively prove that the race which inhabited this mysterious cavern was of Oriental origin, possibly from Egypt. If true, the article continued, Egypt and the Nile, and Arizona and the Colorado will be linked by a historical chain running back to ages, which staggers the wildest fancy of the fictionist. Along with Professor S.A. Jordan, the Smithsonian was exploring caves which contained ruins. The caves dove 1,480 feet into the earth, with a mammoth chamber from which radiate scores of passageways like the spokes of a wheel. Hundreds of rooms have been discovered, with finds which have never been known as native to this country. The article reports supposedly verbatim a report from Kincaid, who says that he was the first white child born in Idaho and that he had worked for the Smithsonian for 30 years. According to Kincaid, the entrance is nearly inaccessible on government land where no one else would be permitted. Kincaid claimed to have discovered the cavern on his boat journey, some 42 miles up the river from El Toro Crystal Canyon. He saw stairs in the sedimentary formation about 2,000 feet above the river, which he climbed to and found carved stairs and an entrance of a cave. From there he descended until he discovered the mummies. Kincaid described the caves in detail, including a shrine to a god sitting cross-legged with a lotus flower or lily in each hand. The figure almost resembles Buddha, Kincaid said, adding that it's possible that his worship most resembles the ancient people of Tibet. He described tools of copper and a gray metal which puzzles scientists and resembles platinum. Granaries of hard cement still held seeds. Surfaces everywhere were covered in hieroglyphics. He estimated that upwards of 50,000 people could have lived in the caverns comfortably. He also described a room with gloom that could not be penetrated by lamps and that smelled snaky, as in, like snakes. The story, though incredible, doesn't seem to have been widely covered in other newspapers, and the story seems to have simply faded out. The Coconino Sun, published in Flagstaff, Arizona, published a short and skeptical article which simply said it seems to be a splendid piece of imagination sent out by some Mulhattanized individual. Mulhattanized referred to Joel Mulhattan, a famous hoaxer known for telling outrageous lies in an effort to have them published by newspapers in the 1870s and 1880s. The Sun went on, the man who wrote up the find certainly had to dig for some details and was wise in locating the entrance at a point on a sheer wall where no one but a person with a great imagination could reach it. There are several other issues. S.A. Jordan and G.E. Kincaid are unknown figures. The Smithsonian has repeatedly denied the story in no uncertain terms. There was a David Starr Jordan, an ichthyologist, a scientist who studies fish, with some relationship to the Smithsonian around the same period, but why an ichthyologist would be in charge of an archaeological expedition is unknown. Kincaid's identity is even less certain. David Childress, an author known for his many pseudo-archaeological and pseudo-scientific publications, discovered the article and included it in a 1993 book that accused the Smithsonian and the U.S. government of a cover-up. The story has taken on a new life since then, with many believing that the original article might have been genuine.
These stories truly were the product of an incredible time when the boundaries of civilization were expanding, and there really were amazing discoveries in science and archaeology. But it was also a time when people's imaginations ran wild because of their dime novels. The demand for these new things simply exceeded the actual supply. Mark Twain, like George Hull, found people's willingness to believe these stories to be somewhat absurd. He wrote that you can hardly pick up a paper without discovering within it one or two glorified discoveries of this kind. The mania, he wrote, is getting a little ridiculous. And in a world when pretty much anybody can post pretty much anything on the World Wide Web accompanied by an AI picture, it's good to take a lesson from history and take everything that you read with a grain of salt.
Does your community have a great piece of folklore that should be shared? Apply for a grant to add a historical marker as part of the William G. Pomeroy Foundation Legends and Lore Marker Grant Program. Legends and Lore is designed to promote cultural tourism and commemorate legends and folklore as part of our heritage.
I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.